Hi everyone, today we have with us Prerna Mukharya, the founder of Outline India, a data firm whose vision is to create social impact through data. Thank you for joining us today, Prerna.
Hi, Kavya. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be part of this webinar today.
Thank you. So to sort of start this off, since we're going to be discussing data and its role in policy today, could you sort of tell us how data is used in making public policy?
Okay, so I want to break down this problem into some very simple examples and constituents, right? Let's, for instance, think about Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, Kavya, right? Now, what was the goal of that policy? The goal was to encourage people to think about using sanitation facilities. So, culturally, not many rural populations would use washroom facilities, or they didn't have the financials to be able to afford one, or they didn't simply understand why they should make use of one, right? The same goes for using boiled water or safe drinking water. And if you think about the ramifications of not having access to safe drinking water or not having access to a washroom facility, those are many, right? If I don't have access to clean drinking water, I'm perhaps consuming contaminated water, bad health outcomes. If I'm falling sick very often, then I'm probably not going to school. Or if I'm a working class person or a working professional, I'm probably missing a lot more days at work. That in turn implies that I'm missing out on wages for X number of days. So there's a lot of direct, indirect consequences of the same, right? For women, it perhaps goes a couple of steps further. So if I don't have access to, there's the issues of dignity, there's the issue of safety, right? If I don't have access to a clean washroom very close to my house, am I walking a couple of kilometers, or am I going in the wee hours of the morning? Right, and I don't want to be caught by someone, etc., etc. So there's a lot of ramifications of not having access to a washroom facility. And again, at all times when I take all these policy examples, Kavya, it's about the superset of India, about 70% of whom live in rural India, right? So when a policy such as Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was set into motion, there was an effort, obviously, by government and policymakers, academics, and not-for-profits alike, to ensure that the trickle down of this policy is far and deep. And again, to break it down further, what does it mean? That people really understood why so much money was being spent on on a campaign such as this. Why was there such a big move to encourage people to start using sanitation facilities? And it is herein that the role of a data organization such as ours at Outline India comes into play. Our role really here is to collect data, collate data, analyze data, and put it out in a very simple, consumable form, such that those who have the capacity or are capable of decision making make informed decisions, right? And again, what kind of data were we collecting? So if you remember, Kavya, when Swachh Bharat Abhiyan came out, there were a lot of limericks that were painted on school walls. So there was a lot of radio messaging that was happening, right? And so we would go out and ask questions such as, do you remember what the radio messaging was, or do you remember reading something on the wall? What does the recall, for a limerick such as that mean to you? What are the keywords that you remember? And if you go out there and ask people, they would say very specific things, and what they would say to us would really vary from community to community. It would vary across states. It would vary on the basis of their socioeconomics. It would vary on the basis of their literacy levels, which basically means that based on who you are, the kind of education you've had, or the kind of community you come from, or the kind of religious background you might have, your perception of a policy, or the kind of exposure you have, your perception of a certain policy or a certain step can really vary. And so, as a data organization, our role is to identify that variation and take home that variation to different policymakers, so that whatever they are launching, whether it's a new program or it's a tracking program or it's an upgradation to an existing program, it can appeal to a lot of these communities or to the main target audience, right? And so data therefore becomes very critical at all steps of the process. And again, I'll break it down. At the time you're thinking of launching a social program, so before you launch it, you obviously want to pilot it. You mean you want to test it out in the field, because what I might think of while sitting in my offices can be very different from the realities on the ground. So I definitely want to test it, and therein, and you know, of course, when we talk about India, we're talking about things at scale. So before you send out something, whether it's money, whether it's disseminating certain information, whether it's subsidies, whether it's your gas wala program or your electricity things, you definitely want to test it out. You want to test out the format, you want to test out what the stakeholder wants, and data becomes very critical. So this is all before a certain program is launched. Let's say there's been something that's been ongoing for a couple of years. You need a data organization, or you need somebody to go in and figure out whether it's going on track. Is it really achieving the targets it's set out to achieve? If it's not meeting those targets, why is that? Right? And again, that why can be answered using both quantitative data, Kavya, qualitative data, and that's again, things that we do. Now, again, let's say during the implementation of the social programmer scheme, in some cases, let's say it's going really well, right? Or let's say certain states have more than outmet their targets, which did happen in India in 5 states actually, specifically for Swachh Bharat. Why was that the case, right? And again, based on some of our field experience, we realized that perhaps Sikkim did really well, and that's because they built these local models, and they had some local champions, and they had some local individuals and organizations that were really pushing for this cause, right? So what the government then wanted for research organizations to do is to go out and talk to these individuals, these organizations, these stakeholders, and figure if we can standardize these models and then take these models to other states. But you can't just lift and copy paste. You've got to tailor it to another state or another community, right? And that's again why you need data whilst a program is ongoing. You again need data because you want to set up checks and balances in place. There's a big body of money involved. And when it comes to policy making, there's real lives or actual lives at stake, right? And when that happens, again, you want to make sure that what you're doing is right, that you minimize negative externalities to the extent possible, and you maximize positive externalities to the extent possible, right? That's again, and by checks and balances in place, to be technical, you might want to set up monitoring frameworks in place, right? That's again why data is important. And then the third, again, for simplicity, is an impact assessment. So let's say your program is near completion. Let's say you set up a 3-year program. Was it a success? Was it a failure? Was it somewhere in between? Or let's say you were running it in Madhya Pradesh, but now you want to take it to Chhattisgarh and Uttar Pradesh. How do you determine scalability? How do you determine replicability? Or how do you simply quantify the impact, right? A lot of funders, not-for-profits, or even policymakers are answerable to the government or bigger bodies. They need data, which in turn is tangible proof that something is working or something isn't, right? And it is for all these reasons that I think data is so important to policy making or anything, or anytime we're looking to do some good. Yeah.
That was
Over to you,
breakdown of why data is so crucial to the process of policy making. In what you were saying, you sort of mentioned how not having access to clean water or toilets, etc., can have an impact on health outcomes. So going off of that line of thought, and the current health crisis that we've been going through, there's been a lot of sort of talk around having a national health registry and to sort of have a centralized model of knowing exactly what a person's health history is, either whether it's linked to your PAN, Aadhaar, etc., and to sort of digitize all of that. Now, around that conversation is also the conversation of the ethical concerns surrounding that, to have this registry without having a data protection policy. So you could tell us a bit about what you make of that and what your thoughts about this are.
It's a bit of a gray zone, Kavya. And I think for the longest time, India didn't have any data laws, right? And I think it's too soon to comment on whether we're on the right track, whether we're off track. I just think it's an incredibly good move for the government to try and devise the right set of laws, which might work within the ambit of India's realities, which are very different from realities in Europe, right? So for instance, a lot of contracts that we currently sign on, and a lot of our partners are in the States, or funders might be in the States, and some of them require for us to be GDPR compliant or compliant, with laws that offer healthcare studies, HIPAA laws, etc. Right now, a lot of those sub clauses or laws may not be very relevant to the context of India. Again, given how sensitive some of the data can be, how development sector data from the grassroots, who owns it, right? So at any point, even a company such as Outline India, we are fiduciaries of data. And what that really means, in again in simple terms, is that we are that organization that collects this data, but at no point can have ownership of these data sets. The ownership of this data really rests either with the government, the big daddy, or the funder, or the actual stakeholder continues to be the actual owner of the data point, right? So for instance, some of these data laws now kind of outline that you as a respondent, let's say I do a survey with you in 2022, it might be well within your right to reach out to me in 2023 and say, Prerna, I no longer want to be part of this entire exercise. I would want you to purge my data, right? Or in a lot of other cases, for instance, since we work on a lot of tricky subjects ranging from child labor, or there might be gender violence, or in some cases, even when we're studying health and education, there might be under 18-year-olds who are young mothers themselves. So this is very sensitive data, right? Data about somebody's healthcare, data about somebody's financials, sexual and reproductive health. And of course, it's not okay for this data to be part of, to be consumable or be shared without the right checks and balances in place. There's a lot of faith that is put into an organization such as ours anytime such information is shared with us, right? So in a lot of cases now, when we sign on to contracts, ethically, we are required to purge all identifiers from the data set. There's a lot of ruling that's coming into place about how we save this data, where we save this data, how we share this data internally, how it will be shared externally, for how many years we have access to the data. In some cases, we request for access to these data sets, Kavya, for internal research or training purposes. In a lot of cases, we're not allowed to do so. So I think present day, there's a lot of gray in terms of what all is permissible, and there is some confusion around it. But I think what's been interesting is that the government of India, a year and a half ago, and we were one of the organizations that was reached out to just to figure out what's needed, right? In a lot of cases, for instance, if you were to look at an Uber, now Uber collecting data on your travel or trip records, or building its own data sets around these. There was another clause in India's data laws that required that some of these data sets, ultimately the ownership rests with the government of India. Now, a lot of these data sets actually constitute the IP of the said company or the IP of the said startup, right? So there was a big furor about how it's not okay to ask some of these startups to share these data sets as and when required, right? So there were some open-ended clauses as well in these data laws. So my point is, of course, the government of India, its intent is perhaps that at the end of the day, these data sets, in a way, it may want access to these data sets if it is looking to do something that can fall under the subhead of doing good or for policy making. But it also becomes tricky because these data sets, might be the USP of some of these organizations. So my point is, to summarize, it's an evolving space. It's a very interesting space, much to be seen. And again, I want to take another example, if I may. I remember a couple of years ago, we tried collecting data sets using drones. And this was aerial data, right? And the goal was that can we help rural or urban planning and, couple up quantitative data with aerial data to figure out landmarks and figure out access. So how far is the school for me? Do I have to climb a hill or cross a river? And is it safe for a girl, etc., etc. So it was trying to develop a wholesome understanding of what a set situation looks like. It was very exciting. And a couple of years ago, there were no rules about or there was a lot of gray area around how high you could fly a drone, etc., right? And who would be the owner of this data set, and you had to seek special permissions. As we recently realized, and now that we have so many drone startups, some of them actually making their hardware in India as well, we see a big trend towards trying to standardize the laws or trying to figure out what makes sense, etc., right? So an evolving ecosystem, much to happen, and a very interesting space to actually look at.
Thank you, Prerna. So our audience is fairly young. So to them, could you sort of tell us some sources of sort of open access data, and how do we sort of reach out and use this data for students to sort of understand policy better, especially through the lens of data?
Okay, so I think if you're looking at policy data, I think the easiest place to start with is looking at government websites. If you're looking for healthcare data, just pick up DHS or NFHS data. A lot of these now are recorded on government websites in very clean, neat ways. Back in the day, a lot of these were simple PDFs that were not readable, but now, with technology, you have a bunch of things. You now have, soft Python codes that you can run on some of these PDF files to sort of download this data into an Excel directly. So that's already possible. I know some researchers and academics who do that already. To a lot of not-for-profits, Kavya, and a lot of donor organizations make their data publicly available. I remember, I know I was part of this conversation with ISB. They have an India data portal that's making a lot of data available open source. Again, I think some World Bank and international banking organizations also make their data sets available open source or downloadable for further research and academic purposes. So I think simply for students, I think it's become so much more easier now. I think you just Google, and in some cases, if you're looking for something very specific, just write to the said person, said academic, said professor, and they'll be more than happy to share the data sets. I mean, we do some internal surveys once in a while, and we've shared those data sets for gratis, for free with some researchers, right? So not so tricky anymore.
I agree. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Prerna. These insights have been very useful, and I'm sure everyone watching will find them just as insightful. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Kavya. Good fun. Thank you so much. Bye.